Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by Alex Pawlowski, a seasoned product strategist with deep expertise in blockchain and Web3 applications. Today, we will be discussing DePIN, or Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Networks. Quite a mouthful. Fortunately, Alex has been helping companies across real estate, food, and manufacturing rethink and revolutionize their processes using this technology. So, without further ado, welcome to the show, Alex.
Thanks for having me, guys.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's kind of cold outside, but it's warm in here, so I'm good to go. What about you?
Yeah, I'm all good. I'm super excited to have you on. We've been trying to get this episode done for a while. It's a topic that we've not talked about, but it is quite an important topic. I'm seeing, this DePIN term used more and more. Thank God there's an acronym because it's quite a mouthful. So I'm super excited to get an expert on the topic to come in and actually tell us what it actually means.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, DePIN is one of these new buzzwords that's been around, and it's a huge thing, I guess. But we'll see. Peak of expectations. As with every new technology, every new trend, we'll see over time how this unfolds.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what good is a new technology if we don't have a new acronym for it as well, right? So, yeah, why don't we start off there then by just going straight into the 101 of what this term means. So, DePIN, decentralized physical infrastructure networks. What
Right.
on earth does that term mean, right? Could you just give us a really basic example, maybe, and explain how that differs from traditional kind of networks that we have?
Right. So we can break it apart, I guess. So we have the physical side of it, and we have the governance side of it. Because if you think of decentralization, most people are really puzzled with what it really means. And I think of it as a spectrum, right? So it's centralization, decentralization are spectrums. And in my opinion, you can really attain one of both. It's more like, okay, how are you positioned, right? And then you have with these physical networks of things, could be widgets, appliances, physical things, infrastructure. And if you look at DePIN, you have sometimes it's called the decentralization of infrastructure and then public infrastructure. So I would look at it as if we look at an economy, we have the three components: transport, communication, energy. And then everything that falls under the category could be a radio tower, could be streets, could be roads, could be really anything that you can also digitize because it makes it really worthwhile, interesting to look at. But then grids, right? Physical grids to distribute and generate energy would be interesting. And then the governance side of that. And if we now expand into the decentralized side, it's really about the access for the public to be closer to that subject. So if you say you're not only a consumer but also a producer in the future, you have a solar panel on your roof, you can now also produce, and every excess energy can be sold to other people, or in general redistributed. And it's in particular interesting because the government has an interest in that because they struggle with this transition to renewables. If we look at the energy sector, and you have control energy, so there's a surplus and a shortage because it doesn't shine all day and there's rain. You can not really foresee what the weather's going to be next week. So the government has an interest in the future because we have more people and thus, a higher demand in energy. And now with new technologies, there's a higher demand anyway. So there must be, an interest from the government side in the future to have these additional points of success, if you will. So not one point of failure as in the past. So you have the one company to fail, and if it fails, you have a blackout or brownout. Instead, you have different little power generators or radio towers. The same applies to the telco sector, I guess.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, the governance side is complicated, right? We're going to spend a lot of time probably talking about DAOs and how to manage things and how to govern things and how to get consensus and all this kind of stuff. But purely like the example you gave there on power, like we're in the UK, it's probably one of the most cost intensive places in the world to build any big bit of infrastructure, any big project. Like you try and build, try and build a solar panel farm, you try and build, I don't know, wind farms, whatever it is. There's a million people that don't want to do it, right? Not in my backyard, or NIMBYs as they're called. They don't want these big wind farms in their back garden. But we need to hit net zero, and more we're seeing that these projects need to happen no matter what. And I think that's a really good example already that kind of highlights the need for this kind of stuff. Is if I want to put a solar panel on my roof or in my garden, that might be great for me. But then what if I have excess? The idea that I can then contribute to like a larger whole and say sell it to other people around the country, or even start to do like peak load balancing and all this kind of stuff. That's really powerful. Just that one example already makes sense why this kind of stuff needs to happen.
Yeah, and it's so there's this need. You have always, I look always at the supply side and demand side, and it's a particularly interesting because if we look from the Web3 perspective, everything that happened so far, most of it was digital, right? So of course you have data warehouses, you have the compute, but it gets really interesting when people get drawn in because they live in the physical world and they have much more of a relationship also from a necessity side. Okay, I'm much more interested in real world things because I follow the news, I follow what happens out in the world, and I can't in the future, maybe I don't have to blame the government anymore because the power grid fails, I blame the government, and now I can actually cut out the intermediaries or have a much more closer relationship to what happens. And if I invest or provide my energy, I'm actually, from a purpose side, I'm closer to the narrative, right? So win-win.
Yeah. I mean, I really like the ethos that you're kind of espousing with it. I want to stay on the idea of, DePIN as a concept because I think already, you're mentioning Web3, but the kind of what you talked about initially was much more, I guess, high level conceptual than that. So is DePIN, is it both a concept to do with how we democratize governance of existing physical infrastructure and physical infrastructure networks? Is it that as well as being a kind of tech suite that involves other things like maybe Web3 that we'll get into, or do they coexist? Are they kind of one and the same in your mind?
As far as I'm concerned, I mean, there are prominent projects like Helium, projects like Render. So Helium is for wireless networks. Render is for providing access to compute because we already face a shortage of that because AI eats up a lot of data and also energy. And Filecoin is another one. So storage space. Just to mention three notable projects. So Web3 is of course older than DePIN. DePIN just popped up because we have these parallel developments in IoT and Industry 4.0, 5.0, and this convergence now happens simultaneously. So you have AI plus IoT, you have quantum, all these other things. And the question really is how they intersect and how people can access them. So is it just something industry professionals, large corporations can do and use? And with Web3, you have the democratization because it happens simultaneously on the side. And Web3, as you know, is basically the Internet of Value. So I love to look at it as the ERP system on the internet to account for things that happen. So who did what when? And then essentially as the smallest common denominator, the wallet, the person that's represented by a digital ID or a wallet, and what that person can basically do and how they can carry back and forth their information and their value, how they can gain from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I see it in the same way in that, like, as you said, DePIN has emerged much more recently than Web3 as a concept, and it seems kind of, in my mind at least, almost Web3 native, right? Web3 is the tools, and we'll get into kind of more of the detail, but those are the tools that people are using to realize the grander vision, the thesis behind DePIN, which is, as you said, decentralizing these networks, making them more robust, potentially making people incentivized to participate in them. You mentioned Filecoin there. I think that's a really interesting example because actually that's been around for a long time, a lot longer, I think, than the term DePIN probably has. So maybe for our listeners, could you just break down what Filecoin is as an example of one of these kind of DePIN concepts in action for us?
So maybe first thing first, I'm not endorsed or affiliated with Filecoin. So
Sure.
I'm a consultant. So I didn't introduce myself. I'm a consultant. I advise big corporations, SMEs, and startups how they can make more or anything of decentralized technology and embed that stuff into their business. But speaking of Filecoin, it's really providing access to file storage to store things, information, and it goes both ways. So it's the same with consensus mechanisms. If you're a miner, for those that don't know, right, you have this world of consensus mechanisms where you have to ensure the integrity of a transaction in the blockchain Web3 world. And in the old world, in the old realm, there was this POW called proof of work, where people would mine, they would have a data center, and as another token appreciation, as a reward, they would get, an incentive, a monetary token incentive. And now it's more the staking side. And this is basically the same with Filecoin, but with a different consensus mechanism and with file storage. So it's interesting because if we think of usual assets, we only think about physical things and everything that you'll find in your balance sheet, right? But the intangibles are particularly interesting in the future. If we look at things as attention, right? If we look at the Brave project, the Brave browser, if you heard about that, and everything that really goes along the lines of what else can an asset be. So storage is also one, but of course we never thought about storage as an asset because there's enough of that. It used to be. That could change in the future. That could change in the future, as with compute, because again, training data. At some point in 26, I read about that 26, 27, 28, we will run out of training data, and this could very well happen also with the shortage in materials driven by this new shift of a multipolar world. Very interesting.
I'm glad you brought up Brave. We actually had someone on the show from Brave, and the topic was Web 2.5 and kind of bridging, what is now the current web with what could be the future of the internet. And I kind of see this as somewhat to do with that, like you kind of linking traditional technologies, traditional infrastructures with some of the components of Web3 to kind of create this middle ground of the two. So we kind of touched on like some of the issues that DePIN is trying to address, but why is it such a game changer? Could you really highlight some of the fundamental problems that we're seeing right now with traditional infrastructure that this is really trying to revolutionize?
Well, I think the most interesting thing is that we can finally access all the physical devices and coordinate them. So if you think of cars, this shift to renewable cars, but especially autonomous driven cars, robots, once they enter the workforce, especially in lower level tasks, dangerous tasks, there's this 4Ds, dull, dangerous, dirty, and dear. I think that's the 4Ds. It's quite interesting to look at how, because there's so much resource outside and not in the hands of companies and authorities, because everybody owns something, but how can that actually help to serve a higher cause, right? So the energy transition is one such example. And there's always this narrative of people or by people when they say, okay, what is it that I, small person, can do to improve the state of the status quo? So I think that whatever it is that you can contribute, and it's the same with ride hailing, right? Or ride sharing. If you can just have resources that sit idle, not in your garage, but at home, or in your attic, right? If you own stuff and you're not aware what you own, but you can actually plug it into the system, that can somehow work for you for some benefit. And but it's the same that already works with compute. So there are already projects out there like Go Mining, where you can actually earn rewards by providing your idle compute. So if your laptop runs all day, 24/7, or just for the day, 8 hours, and you use it effectively for 5 hours, you can just let it turn on the application, earn rewards, and give away the compute for 3 hours. So that's something that you can already effectively do. And then research projects or other applications on a higher level and higher magnitude can tap into that and utilize it. And so it's basically you can it's particularly interesting because you can tap into a lot of tiny points of resource instead of just one company owning everything, and that's the decentralization side. So one
That
is
makes sense.
That's the access part. So people have access, they get a say on a lower level, and then the other thing is the governance, right? So I think that's a very particularly interesting.
Yeah, I like that. I think kind of democratizing and distributing access to kind of create lots of little points that can all contribute to a whole is always a good thing. Not just for the community buying stuff to make people feel a part of something, but also when we start to talk about the tenets of blockchain, this kind of overlaps that a lot, right? We have a big problem with monopolies in the UK over water, transport, all these kind of things. So if you start to have other options built up of lots of individuals, then you start to get an increased resilience, right? If one of those small individuals goes down, that's actually fine because I have a million other individuals that can contribute it. And yeah, the other thing is reducing the reliance on monopolies, which hopefully creates a more competitive and eventually cheaper market. And we're talking a lot about blockchain here. So in my mind, I'm kind of seeing this as two general overarching areas. You've got the blockchain stuff, which kind of handles the value exchange for some service, and then the idea of governance tokens and all this kind of stuff, and the way you actually democratize stuff. And then you've got the hardware side, the physical assets, which is kind of, you talked about IoT to manage it, but there's probably something that's a bit further down the line, which is like the actual water source or whatever. Is there any like more granularity there, or are those two kind of a high level areas about right?
Well, we would have to look at a particular value chain and break it down, really. I mean, there's so much. Well, let me start the other side, because we're speaking from a very idealistic point of view. There's a lot that you can digitize, but your toaster doesn't need Wi-Fi. I think we can agree here. Your toaster,
not yet, maybe one day,
it doesn't need Wi-Fi. So there's a lot of stuff. There's still a lot of friction that will result from this. But what it does is basically it creates a large network, an ecosystem of things that can coordinate and cooperate together. And as I said before, some of these challenges that we face, there's no other way than just looking at the entire landscape, the entire, as I said, the ecosystem of value. Because back in the old days, in the old world, you had just a couple companies that would create value by chopping down wood, forest, and then they would just burn the wood and create energy and use that energy to power your chimney or your furnace, your car. And now it's a whole different level where we are more aware of what's happening in the world, and we can control the system, maneuver the system in these ways. But I would say it really requires to look particularly into the value chain of energy or transport or any other industry to really look at what makes sense, what doesn't. And I wouldn't be also too idealistic about decentralizing, as I said before, this word, very magical, but I would instead search for the largest common denominator. Interoperability is also such a thing that you can combine, because the government will never allow to decentralize everything, right? So we're not living in an anarcho-capitalistic state or an anarchistic system. No, that's not going to happen. So the state has an interest because it deals with power, it has to do with power, existence, or those kind of things, power interests and geopolitical interests. So, but what it can do is it can create like a second resource, or it can prevent this single source of failure. I think governments and institutions are very aware of that.
That's a really interesting point you bring up there. So like you say, a lot of this DePIN stuff is, I imagine, applied to like fundamental infrastructure like water, electricity, things that governments have, they have to keep intact, right? And if all of a sudden I'm saying I'm putting this on a public blockchain, right, and say a large percentage of, say, the UK's now power supply is based on, let's say, something like Ethereum, right? All of a sudden the UK government's going, well, this is very much out of my control. Like, I don't know who these actors are who are controlling this. There could be, I'm not saying it could be, because it's actually really difficult to do, but it could be overthrown by like a foreign agent, whatever, with lots of money. Is this something that like is being talked about in the DePIN infrastructure? Does it limit the applications of this stuff, like you say, if the governments are so heavily involved in this?
It does intersect with smart city initiatives. Smart Dubai is one such example. I mean, I heard this in conversation. And some jurisdictions and governments are not well democratic, so it's not that difficult to imagine what that means. But I think there's still a lot of room in between. In smart city initiatives, there's a lot of open data, if you're aware of the concept. So that information that is captured directly or indirectly, and then provided to the public for secondary use. So like city furniture, for example, or city lighting, or that kind of information, weather information, pressure, temperature, sensoring, and then so that's completely, I think, in between and in line with what a government wants. Improving the level of quality, well-being, I think that really plays in the hands of the government. But But when it comes to anything that would undermine the legitimacy of a government, that wouldn't be very interesting, I guess. That wouldn't be, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting aspect of DePIN, right? Because I think maybe more so than lots of other technologies you have in and around the Web3 space right now, I feel like DePIN has its physical, let's say, challenges or the technology challenges, right, which are being addressed with various things. But it's inherently complex because, as you're saying, you've got everything from the actual kind of blockchain-based networks that help monitoring and distributing rewards and things like that in the system. You need to connect that with the IoT world and the smart city to get the data in, maybe oracles too. So there's lots of technical challenges. But to me, I almost think what you're highlighting there is probably the bigger one, right? Is how do you get these things off the ground, bootstrapped, get them adopted? Because as you say, the interests of the people who own most of these networks currently aren't necessarily aligned with the people who want to, us, basically the people who want to build these kind of secondary networks as you described them. So, what kind of ways do you think these networks can achieve success? Like, what kind of strategies could people employ for these new ways of doing DePIN networks that can help them kind of gain that network effect and kind of go global?
Thanks for mentioning network effects. That's I think the most misunderstood concept out there. When it not only it's within blockchain, outside blockchain. When we think of ecosystems, so we have apps, and we have platforms, and then platform economy is well understood, but then ecosystems of platforms and everything beyond is very difficult to grasp and derive value from. So with network effects, the way I look at it, and I wrote an article about this, I would compare it to a city, and the incentive for an individual, an institution, or any other entity to settle in that city. So you and I, if we move to the UK, or if I moved to the UK, for me it was a no-brainer, because I had this spot where I studied in London, and I worked in London. But there was then the question, okay, where do I settle next? Do I even settle anywhere? For you, the question is, do you just leave for another place because electricity cost is cheaper somewhere else? Probably not. You have different other opportunities. You can just switch to provider. But then if the quality of life is better, air quality, everything, et cetera, living costs, and then infrastructure, et cetera, and then your salary, your wage has an increase. There's an increase to that. I think it's the same here. So network effects derive when people gather, so volume of people in one place, and enough things to do for enough people. In other words, if you project it to a platform, and then they interact in a way that it benefits the most of these people. So if you have a public square in a city, and people move to London because, oh wow, there's Big Ben, a lot of history, a lot of British culture, and then also your job, and then there's your your belief, your religion. Then there's a lot of pubs. Then there's the university, and then all these other historic things, and friends, of course, your family. So that builds network effects, because it gives people no more reasons to interact. And if we project, and if we now transfer that to the deep, it's no different. So creating the conditions and requirements that a lot of people flock in, and then they can derive maximum value from it. So in the network effect fashion, more people know and interact with more people, and then the value that is generated increases.
That makes sense. I think that's what was one of my first kind of hesitations with this stuff you're talking about. Selling solar panels, solar power everywhere, or Uber and all this kind of stuff that kind of democratize access to these things. But if you've got one person with a car who's doing Uber, that's not a successful app, right? So the big thing here is buy-in, and the question is, how do you get buy-in, both on the actual kind of consumer side, but also on the producer side, right? And I think it's kind of, a lot of the appeal here has to be more than just it's a DAO, right? You see it everywhere. It's a DAO. Oh, cool. Everyone gets to vote on things, like blah, blah, blah. Doesn't always mean anything. You always need a bit more than that to justify the blockchain angle, in my mind. I think a really cool application here, we're talking about energy and reselling energy. I'm like, okay, why is a blockchain good for reselling energy? Yeah, it democratizes stuff, but you could probably just do that in a Web2 fashion. A cool thing here, in my mind, would be, okay, green energy. carbon credits, all this kind of stuff. We've seen that there's been a whole host of issues with carbon credits sold around the world that aren't authentic, that are duplicated, triplicated, all these kind of things, like they've been made many, many times over, and none of it's actually from the source and authentic. A big thing here is that, put it on a public blockchain. Sure, there's some trickiness with, you need IoT that's also verified. You need someone to be signing off to say this is the only authenticated bit there. But then you do get a way to actually easily sell stuff once you've got that proof authentication in a database that's open that anyone can check and verify. So in my mind, that's a really good application of this stuff, green energy and carbon credits in a DePIN fashion. Do you have any you've been consulting in this space for a while, you've got lots of different use cases. Are there any real killer applications that you can think of that really marry this idea of like the hardware and the IoT side plus the blockchain and the governance side to really make like a true DePIN system that works?
I would say it's not even in Europe. It's waste disposal. Some of these really critical issues. I would point to Southeast Asia. I was involved with something there, and it has to do with getting rid of all the plastic from the ocean and from the environment. And I think this really points also to the big application fields, or why we even need decentralization for anything. Decentralization's potential really unfolds if you have a high degree of complexity that you can tackle with a centralized system or just one, because coordination completely fails, so there's no possible. And then emergency. So if the system breaks down, or if you look at a particular disaster relief, right? Disaster relief or disaster management. Now in the US, there's this hurricane, this big storm. And then setting something in place that can mobilize all the resources. So everything's, the whole system broke down. You have no infrastructure, you have no communication, internet, nothing's available. And now you need to help people and mobilize resources. So how do you do that? And but that's just one example. One example was involved was the trash and garbage removal aspect.
Alex, can you explain that one? Like, I'm trying to work out how that actually works as a solution. Like, I don't get it right now.
Yeah, so in Europe, we're very used to a lot of standards. There's not even the question to not have a standard or a system for something. So, like if you return your plastic here in the Netherlands or in Germany, you're incentivized for that. You pay a premium of 25 cents per plastic bottle, and then you throw it in the vending machine if you upon return, and then you receive the coupon, and you can redeem the money, get it back. And it works in a very similar way, but you have the ledger and your ID in between, and you have also all these ways to get incentivized non-financially or financially. So I think non-financial stuff is very interesting because you get more insights into what happens, how the garbage is removed, what happens with the plastic, because that's a concern to people. And then you can have a say in what to do with the plastic, how to further develop the system, make decisions, and then also get a reward, get a discount for public transport. For a long time, there was, I forget if it was Indonesia, I can't remember, but you could pay with plastic. You could literally put your plastic and buy a bus ticket with plastic, like in the bag. It's insane. But it works in similar ways. So you have, again, in that particular example I was involved with, there was a high degree in complexity, a lot of mess, so trash, and then building a system where a lot of people can actually act cleaners to the system, where they can bring, they pick the trash, because paying a lot of people would, take forever, and the government doesn't have the money. So instead, you turn the people into servants in a way, but incentivize them for good behavior. And this is also a way I 2 years ago I was involved in a civic project that you funded, and I coined the term stimulation by participation. I called it that because I discovered, I'm not even a scientist, but we wrote this book and we worked on this model city called Fab City, so local production, global collaboration. And I figured out that if you give people access and all the necessary means, you can build a platform where people can actually work for you, but only as long as you put a strict purpose at the core of the platform. If you just say it's for profit, then people will not do anything. They will just, in the Web2 fashion, come in, they will get what they need, for instance, an insurance, log out again, and eventually it'll come back, but probably not. In Web3, it's different because we have all these NGO and for-purpose projects. And if people are very aware and know exactly what they're working towards, you can break it down. You can say, okay, you only have 2 hours per day. You have the resources, you have a car, fine, you have a bike, you can also do something for or against climate change on a very low level. But and it's the same with the trash. So everybody can bring as much trash and turn it into or turn it in as possible. 1 hour per day time or 10 hours. So it doesn't make a difference really.
Yeah, I do. I completely agree with that kind of the concept that at the end of the day, like we are quite tribal as humans, right? And like the tribe that's formed bigger civilizations is like stories and like things that connect us and values and all this kind of stuff. You can sell a story and a value, people really will buy into that and be part of that. And capitalism's kind of one story, but less and less people are kind of driven by that.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm also a capitalist, but I try to improve capitalism beyond its very primitive roots, and I would love to see something like it. So I'm a realist, really. I really look at the system. Okay, what can we effectively do with what we have and where we are at the moment, right? So it's exactly what you said. It's that's the point.
And like honestly, yeah, I'm a capitalist too. I believe that like money's what makes the world go around in a way. But like when you see these startups and like the kind of the real startups where it's like 2 or 3 people, they're typically not driven by money, right? They're driven by a mission, like something that they think is their like from God calling, and they're the people that really change the world. And a lot of it is also capitalism somewhere else, but like I think sometimes it is the story. But we're getting really off topic here. We're talking about on the ledger and this project to do with rubbish. Like I actually kind of really do get that as well, especially when you're in, say, Southeast Asia, where I imagine the real kind of value add of blockchain technology there is kind of twofold in my mind. One is that, okay, a lot of the people, a lot of the things that are that are contributing to the trash in the ocean are from Western countries. They're the Coca-Cola bottles, the Pepsi Max bottles, the crisp packets, and more we're seeing that these companies are being regulated and held accountable for actually producing this stuff and not actually doing anything about the waste that it's creating. I imagine one thing we could start to do is if you have like unique identifiers for the trash can or whatever, not the trash can, sorry, the Coke can. And then you say, okay, well, this has now ended up in Indonesia and it's been recycled. And you can start to monetize the recycled Coke can and link it back through a blockchain to say, okay, this has been recycled. It's monetized back by the original creator and producer of that. That's one reason we might need to have this public ledger that can go, cross globe, cross enterprise.
The immutability of the accounting. So, as I said before, a lot of people are disillusioned because they've heard the term decentralization. As we are as humans, we always go to the max, right? To the most extreme. Oh, decentralization, it's all going to be unrelated. You can't touch it, but it will work wonders, right? It's not what it is. It's as I said in the beginning, it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum, and part of it are decentralized, part of it are less decentralized, because you can never take out the people and the ways people can mingle or interfere with the system, like these 51% attacks, and then all the problems that you mentioned at the beginning with DAOs, right? So, user engagement is a problem. Power distribution is another problem. Incentives are another problem. And I think we didn't really touch the incentives because I think I dropped off there a little with the network effects. But in particular, non-financial incentives are interesting. So if I, for instance, again, the example with Southeast Asia, if I collect 1 kilo or 1 pound of plastic on Monday or every week for a month, I can get 10% off if I buy a bus ticket for another month, right? So these kind of interesting non-financial incentives where people say, you know what, it's actually very useful. I could do that every month, every day, and also have a benefit if I continue doing so. So again, this stimulation by participation thing. You're not forced to do something. You stimulate. You're stimulated because you have incentive. And this is also something that puts off people because they think, gamification. It's gamification, it's manipulation. You can't do that with a group, right? And I get that a lot. And I think, okay, then what's it gonna be? Like what else? Like there's nothing else. You can't really make it, natural. This is too much of a big problem. The problem is too large. There's no natural solution to this, right?
Yeah.
We created this problem in an unnatural way because we developed over millennia and millions of years, and our impact on the world has exceeded what we can actually afford to do, right? So we can destroy the system, in other words. Other primal animals, I mean, I know I'm diverting a little, but we can actually, we're the first creatures that can actually destroy their habitat and their ecosystem for good.
And I think it's interesting you say, people criticize gamification, but no one's forcing you to play the game, at least not now anyway, right? And I think gamification has huge merits. Like there's a lot of research behind the power of it and the way it can, compel real change. But also, you were mentioning that it's not about punitive action, it's about stimulation, right? It's about positive incentivization. We spoke about this with Sunny as well recently on the show. I think it's really powerful, and it's something that we're seeing more and more. Like the scheme you mentioned with recycling, I think is a perfect example. One of my favorite use cases. We have a similar thing coming in Scotland and the UK. I always mention this one where you're doing exactly the same deposit and reward scheme, right? It's going to happen. I don't think it's using DePIN in like the Web3 way, but hopefully it will at some point. And another thing I think is really, really interesting as a use case of DePIN is actually it's kind of around data sharing, and especially in industrial situations. So I actually had the fortune to speak to a friend who was working in the kind of supply chain sector and kind of procurement, and they really enlightened me, like it blew me away with the lack of information that's shared between people, but who should be working together, right? They're in a trade with one another. They should be explaining, and I'm talking about things like scheduling. So if you have a producer of a raw material, they are going to be selling every month to some downstream contractor or something. They need a raw material, but they won't tell them until it's almost too late to do it, and you have this just in time manufacturing cycle. If they could just be broadcasting their expected intake and usage a bit ahead of time, then this could be done so much more efficiently. You don't have to have a lorries going and doing a single delivery and going back empty, that kind of thing, right? It's really, really wasteful. So that's one of my favorite use cases.
Thanks for saying that. I totally, you inspired me to say the following. What the blockchain really does, and that's interesting, is it makes you more aware of transaction effects. It makes you more aware of consequences, because as you know, the transaction can only happen if the information level asymmetry is complete. So the information symmetry, as you said. So in the real world, human behavior is, I mean, intentionally, not intentionally, sometimes a little manipulative, or you just wait things out, you defer the process because, you want to, I don't know, have the upper hand, but also you forget, and you have all these deficiencies, human deficiencies. But then with blockchain, it's the case is you have a complete state of information, because you have these contracts, and they can only trigger if you meet these requirements. And the effect on transaction effects is also very interesting, because you have search costs, negotiation costs, all these relationships between people. And the question is how this will long term, I find this really fascinating, how this will change or can, benefit society if we are more aware of what we're doing. And would we rather not do something? I mean, this can also go the other way. This can also have detrimental effects, because what about entrepreneurial risk taking? This is very irrational too. This is something I find very interesting.
Yeah, speaking of things that we find interesting, I see you on LinkedIn a lot. That's how actually this conversation came about, and a lot of the time you're talking about AI. So we have to have a question on, what could be the impact of integrating AI, broad stroke AI with DePIN? Like, how do you think this might shape the future?
I would say, generally speaking, all the deficiencies that would also be interesting to observe without decentralization, like making things more efficient, adjusting deficient systems, making up for human deficiencies like error control or issue handling, and then all the analytics stuff. That's very interesting. And then what we're now looking at is the autonomous agent frontier, where these systems, like for the audience, like a programmable bot that can basically break beyond the proprietary system. And I teach this at university, because most people say, oh, well, this is just, a more efficient, intelligent Alexa. Well, it's not, because it can go beyond Amazon. You can you can provide it with access to your keychain and can say, okay, like your assistant, make a call on Monday, 8 a.m. in the morning, schedule me an appointment at my hairdresser, and then take the credentials from my banking account and then wire $8,000 to account B. And then you can all do all these things. And they can themselves trigger new or other systems that are more proficient at what they do. So this is something I think is very interesting because we have now these systems that interact without the interference of people. And of course they can, replace, they can augment people. This is very interesting.
Mm.
Sometimes they can even interact because the speed and the frequency is too high, like in IoT. If you have a system that triggers a database and you have these thousands of data pieces of information that go back and forth, and there's of course no person in between, you need a smart contract or something to account for who's responsible if something fails or ensuring it doesn't fail. Like if Bosch or Siemens have these waves and networks of sensors, I mean, there has to be something in between that.
Yeah, I think that whole conversation about almost like AI agents, right, being able to go out and do tasks for you is super, super interesting. And now that you've even got these high fidelity voices that you can model, you can have them go and do all your kind of talking as well at some point.
Yeah.
What really scared me the other day is seeing. I don't know if you've seen this one. There's something now where you can create a podcast based on a document. Have you seen this one?
LL Notebook, I think, the Google
That's the one.
LL
Yeah,
Notebook,
the
whatever it is.
Google one.
I spend a lot of time just putting my info in there and getting like the satisfaction of it telling me the things I've done in a nicer way.
Yeah, I mean, it really depressed me when I did it because I was like, "Well, they're doing a better job than we are in the podcast, and they're not even real." But yeah, I think
But to be quite fair with the developments in AI, I mean, this doesn't only relate DePIN and a blockchain. I think a lot of people, I think a lot of people are afraid, but I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. I mean, we have these natural bottlenecks, and of course, you have billions of dollars that flow into investment to ramp up data warehouses and fine training data, but eventually we will run out of that because we have, of course, regulations that really put a bumper in front of this endless hunger for these training models. And then we also have again the same example as with the toaster, the Wi-Fi toaster. People don't want everything to include AI. And I think I read about this. It was a Apple or another tech company. They're developing a new device to make usability or accessing AI easier. So they don't find it. These AI researchers and companies, they don't find that the laptop or the smart glass. I'm not sure about the smart glass, but the smartphone. It's not the end game for AI. It's going to be either like ubiquitous, somewhere integrated in the walls when everything is a computer, or there's going to be another device that people will wear or hold in their pocket and access the AI. So and then the other thing is, I mean, I see it in my everyday work. I have very well automated away and augmented at least 40%, nearly 50% of my workload, and I can do more. It's not that I really miss that stuff because it's really daunting stuff. It's I can search faster, I can evaluate faster, I can generate content. But I teach this. That's what I teach my student. I tell, okay, you need to be careful. You really need to check the result and then see it more as because AI is about asking the question. It's about context.
exactly.
And you draw the window, and within the window, you ask the questions. And if you can't ask the questions, you basically it's useless, right? So still need to be an engineer and undergo this education engineering in order to know what it means to build a fundament or build a roof or be knowledgeable about statics and all these other research fields.
Yeah, it's very true that it's going to put power in the hands of those who can ask the right questions. And
Yeah.
speaking of asking the right questions, Alex, so thank you so much for your time today and giving us this crash course into DePIN, which is one of these topics that I think a lot of will be new to a lot of people, but whether or not they've heard the term. So thank you for that. And just to finish then, so on these questions that we like to ask, we have two kind of standard ones that we ask everyone. So if you're ready, I'll fire the first one at you. Okay.
Sure.
So in one sentence, in just one sentence, because we've had plenty of people be liberal with this one before. What is Web3 to you?
The Internet of Value.
Very nice. I like that one. It's
Mystic.
I think
Yeah.
it's good.
Yeah,
I think it's the old ones are the gold ones, right? Like that's one of the I think
That's
how Ripple used to describe it. So yeah, I like that too.
That's true. And one word would be more difficult, but I can't do that. Like Web3 with one word. That's so hard. Yeah.
Something it becomes more cringe the fewer words, so it's okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
And then the final question then, Alex. So if you could choose anyone on the planet now from throughout history, or maybe it's even someone fictional that you'd like to talk to, and you get to sit down with them over dinner and talk about Web3, who would that be for you and why?
It would be one of you guys.
Oh, which one?
Nice.
Let's do it. No,
Half of each, nice. But yeah, Alex, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you
Like,
very
I'm glad
much.
we finally got to have this happen. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to those listening, wherever you may be, and join us next time to untangle a little more of Web3. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.